Hello, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at two of comic book's new recent big bads. These are two characters, in my opinion, are going to go down as the antagonist of this era. This of course being Knull, the God of the Void from Marvel Comics, and the Darkest Knight, the idea that Batman always wins from DC Comics. I'll be going over skills, power, and most importantly for these two, their abilities, as that is what this battle will come down to the end. Now before we get started, I do think it is important for you guys to subscribe and like the video, as I will be doing more comic book lore video and even some more matchup videos. Starting with the symbiote god Knull. He first appears as a background character in the seminal Thor God of Thunder run known as the God of the Void. The first bit of scaling we have for Knull would be him scaling above a character that a lot of people think is the strongest character in all of Marvel Comics, that being Oblivion. We have many different statements showing that Knull is the god and the ruler of the void, the creation before time. If Oblivion is this void and he is being ruled over by Knull, this should scale Knull above him. First, I'm going to start by scaling Oblivion. Let's look at how he describes himself and the realm he resides over. Before the multiverse was I. At the end of all things, I wait. I am the void, the breath between life and death, between death and rebirth. My true form is beyond form, beyond shape, and beyond substance. This body, this realm, everyone and everything in it are my creations. For those in the versus battle community, these are pretty obvious and clear outerversal statements for Knull and his realm. For those who are not, I'm going to quickly describe what this term outerversal means and how strong it should really make a character. If we go off how typical dimensional tiering works both in Marvel Comics and in fiction in general, higher dimensional characters have absolute power over the lower realms. So a 5th dimensional character would have absolute power over 4th dimensional spaces. Now, to go from a 3D to a 4D object, we can't just simply get bigger, we sort of need to become inaccessibly stronger or bigger than our previous realms. For example, if I had a 2-dimensional line, no matter how long I drew this line, it would never become a 3-dimensional shape. So this is the difference in power between one dimensional of scaling. Based on these statements, we can see that Knull, or Oblivion specifically, the Void, is above all forms of these dimensionalities and everything is contained within him. This would scale him inaccessibly above them and be at the power level as what we would call outerversal. We also know that Knull himself was around before even Oblivion or the Void, who would represent non-existence. Knull being around before this shows he does not rely or need concepts like existence or non-existence to be a thing or to exist. It's kind of weird, but you know, listen, it's comics. We just have to accept what we get given. This is the simplest way that we can easily scale Knull. Of course, he has many other feats and showings such as beating Celestials, but we have a versus matchup to get to and another character to scale, and then we have to get through all their abilities, so I'm just going to stick with this for now. Now for the Darkest Knight. We'll be using his final version after his fight with Perpetua, where he steals all of her powers and he still has all the powers of Dr. Manhattan. To scale his powers, the easiest way is simply just to say, what does Perpetua scale to? Well, Perpetua scales to being the creator of the DC multiverse. Well, what does that scale her to? Well, we know that even realms simple as the sphere of the gods, which is, you know, a mid-tier realm when it comes to the DC cosmology, is stated to be platonic and there are infinite dimensions below it, as we know that the bleed contains an infinite amount of dimensions. To obviously have the power to create a realm such as this, you would have to have what I would describe that Knull had earlier would be outerversal scaling to be beyond all these forms of dimensionality, as they don't exist without you and you are creating them. Of course, this would scale to the Darkest Knight. As we see, he gets a power amp from Dr. Manhattan, he's able to fight her, and he also steals all of her own power, showing he should be at least above her when it comes to creation or destruction energies. Now, I know I've scaled them both vaguely to outerversal, but I think it'd be more interesting just to sort of keep them at this level so that they're sort of relative, because a versus matchup where one character easily one-shots and stomps the other character isn't really that interesting. We don't really get to talk about any of the abilities, so I'm going to leave them at that for now, and then we'll come back to this if it's important later on in the end. Another thing that we can quickly go over is the speed that both of these characters would have. Now, both of these characters being outerversal would mean that they're beyond the regular concept of what we would define as speed. We usually measure speed as a distance over time, but if these characters both transcend distance, time, how can we really measure this? Well, this is a level of speed we usually give the label of irrelevant, because the speed at this point just doesn't matter, and I do think they'd be sort of relative to each other. We can argue about, oh, you know, this character is speedless, this one character or another character. Maybe we can find someone who has a slight edge, but for now, I'm going to keep them at relative. Now, let's get to the interesting part of this video. Let's talk about their actual abilities and how they would match up with each other. I'm going to start by using their kind of weaker abilities, their more mundane stuff, and slowly build up to their strongest abilities to see who wins. We can start from good old fisticuffs, you know, hand-to-hand combat. The Darkest Knight, being a Batman, obviously has some impressive skill feats, but his most impressive feat or statement would be when he merged with Dr. Manhattan's body, he was able to gain the knowledge and skills of every single Batman across the entire dark multiverse. Now, this is like an infinite multiverse of Batmen who all have statements of mastering all forms of martial arts. So he has all of this combined. For Knull, we don't tend to see him use his skill as much, but we do know he takes all the knowledge from the people he bonds with. So this would include people like Captain America and Black Panther, who are some of the most skilled characters in the Marvel comics, with Black Panther having statements of mastering all martial arts, and Captain America having statements of being adequate or being proficient at most martial arts. Of course, a fight like this will not get sold by people throwing their fists around. As we know, they both have great regeneration. We see Knull being able to snap his jaw back on after getting it ripped off by Thor in the panel before, and the Darkest Knight has multiple back-to-back fights and just heals up every single time he takes damage, to the point where it looks like he's not taking any damage whatsoever. The Darkest Knight also has one other advantage when it comes to his body, but this is something I will touch upon later on in the video. The next thing I think is worth bringing up is how they normally fight. As you see, Knull pulls up enough, he does so with an army of symbiotes, with the stronger ones, which would be relevant, being the dragons. These dragons are able to keep up with Herald tier Marvel characters such as Doctor Strange, who states that he can't bring up his barriers faster than they can break them down. These same dragons are able to keep up with the entire planet of heroes, occupying teams like the Avengers and the X-Men. Knull has two very special summons, these being Grendel and Big Mother. Grendel is able to keep up with people like the Silver Surfer, while Big Mother is stated to be above Hell Lords, who would be characters like Mephisto, Dormammu, Cyttorak, who are all powerful in their own rights. The last set of summons come from his Necroblade. These are not shown directly by him, but by Gore when he summons them to fight for 1,000 years against Old King Thor. So they do have some power in their own rights. This of course is very stacked, but the Darkest Knight himself does have some very impressive goons for his side, of course. The original Dark Knights are who we're going to start off by talking about. The original Dark Knights are counterparts to the main universe's Justice League. Some of the most impressive feats of them being Red Death being able to run past Barry Allen and life drain him passively, and he also does this to other speedsters. The Drowned, who's able to transform people into one of her minions simply by touching them. And we also have the Merciless, who is the god of war. This gives him the ability to amp himself based on all of the conflict around him. We also see that the majority of the Dark Knights are able to beat their main universe counterparts, this being the original Justice League, who have some of the most impressive feats as a team for all fictional characters. We also see the Darkest Knight gain a bunch of new goons when he creates the Last 52, a local connection of universes who have members from every variation of from all the heroes, including a Batman, Wonder Woman, Swamp Thing, and a spooky looking Spectre. The most impressive of these new summons being the Last Son, or Kill All, as we later learn his name is. When it comes to Knull's average summons, they would not be much help, with the dragons, Grendel and Big Mother carrying the majority of the weight for the team. If we are to say that herald tiers for Marvel and DC are both relative to each other, these being members like Hulk, Thor, Doctor Strange for Marvel, and then Superman, Wonder Woman and Barry for DC, since they all have feats that can scale them to the baseline universal and all have their own multiversal feats to boot as well. Going off these assumptions that we can have many debates on, but it is a position I am willing to defend. Join my Discord and debate me if you disagree. We can now say that the Dragons should be able to hold off some of the Darkest Knights, but the most dangerous of the Darkest Knights summons would be the Last Sun. I think this one version of Superman alone would be able to deal with the likes of the Dragons, maybe even the two name summons, but we also have the Spectre and Swamp Things who could deal with them if needed. I think the large number and higher number of top tier summons that the Darkest Army has would eventually give him the win on this point as well. As we see his last 52 abilities based off the new 52 cosmology, which should mean he should be able to create an infinite amount of universes, as he also has perpetuous power, which means he has an infinite amount of summons with different abilities that he can summon at any time he wants. Now we're going to talk about Knull's most iconic weapon, the Necroblade. This was a weapon wielded by Gorr the God Butcher, but was originally created by Knull using the dead body of a Celestial. He uses this dead body as a forge, and this also explains why the symbiotes are weak to fire and sound, as all symbiotes originally come from his sword. The main powers of the Necroblade are corruption and absorption. We see Gorr the God Butcher absorb multiple gods, gaining their powers along the way, and we also see Knull absorb many different people in his time. I don't really think this ability would work on the Darkest Knight, as we see he has Dr. Manhattan's body. And what does this mean? Well, let me explain to you. If you have seen or read Watchmen, you'll understand that Dr. Manhattan's body is only a representation and not necessarily his true self. We see even people like Guy Gardner is able to one-shot his body, while he's then able to beat the entire Justice League and a moon full of heroes. Dr. Manhattan really only exists sort of as a consciousness at this point, using the body just to represent himself whenever he's talking to people. For this reason, I really don't think absorbing the Darkest Knight's body would do anything, as he would also exist as there's some sort of consciousness, as he has part of Dr. Manhattan's powers. The best bet for Knull when it comes to using the corruption and absorption abilities would be to try to use it on the heroes and villains that the Darkest Knight summons, as he could probably get new powers or some knowledge based off this. But the Darkest Knight is incredibly smart, one of the smartest characters we've seen in DC, so he should be able to figure out a simple ability like this and then counteract it by either removing them from the playing field so he has nothing to absorb, or finding some sort of counter to it with his huge arsenal of abilities. I'm just going to quickly talk about how Knull was actually beaten. This was done by Eddie Brock, fueled with the power of the Enigma Force, Knull's opposite, using Surfer's Board and Thor's Hammer all combined just to damage and eventually destroy him, taking over as the God of the Void himself. This goes to show that if you have enough power, you are able to overpower and destroy him, even using some of his weakness to light and to lightning as well. Now for the Darkest Knight. His strongest attribute here would be his intelligence and the ability to get and use whatever powers he wanted at the time. Now you might be asking why or how. Well, we know he creates as many universes as he wants, and they all have different characters and different versions of these characters, right? And we also know that he has all the knowledge from the Batman of the Dark Multiverse, which is even larger than the regular multiverse. Using both of these in conjunction, he could create universes with characters who would have whatever powers he wanted to be able to beat Knull. This would be his go-to way of fighting if he was fighting someone relative to himself, as he simply can't overpower them. He would need to use some sort of hacks or abilities to win. Now we know Knull goes around shouting about being the god of the darkness and the god of the void. It would be a simple matter for the Darkest Knight to simply try some light abilities, or from his many different summons who he can keep track of because of his high intelligence, he could say, oh, these guys are weak to fire or lightning. He should be able to figure out their weaknesses relatively quickly. We even have characters like Black Canary who use high-pitched sounds. All of these would give him an advantage, as he would know all of Knull's weaknesses. In the end, we have to see what they can both do to take each other out. Knull's best ability and the strongest thing that we kind of have for him at this point would be the Necroblade having the ability to destroy gods across all space and time, even destroying their concepts. This is also able to kill Celestials who are also living concepts. This would be fine, but the Darkest Knight is above the realm of concepts to the point that it would not change much for him. As we see, concepts are housed in the sphere of the gods, a realm in which the Darkest Knight scales massively above. For Wonder Woman to be able to even beat the Darkest Knight, she had to take him to the end of time, to the Death Star. The only way they could really beat the Darkest Knight at this point was to simply remove him from the story, to completely and utterly destroy his narrative to the point where he can't really come back. This is very impressive, as we see that he's able to resist Superboy Prime's retcon punches, which is something that can affect even someone like Darkseid. Now, Darkseid is a being who has never been retconned up until this very point, and the only person to ever do it was Superboy Prime. Darkseid survives Crisis of Infinite Earths, Infinite Crisis, Flashpoint. All of these events and never be retcons, but one punch retcons old for Darkseid into a much younger, regular Darkseid that we see. This is why I'm going to be giving this battle to the Darkest Knight. He would be too hard for Knull to put down, while the Darkest Knight could use his intelligence and his vast amount of different abilities to simply get the kill. Knull simply has no counter to the Darkest Knight. His best chances would have been to try to absorb some of the heroes and villains, but at this point, their power level compared to the Darkest Knight really isn't anything to write home about. The Darkest Knight simply is kind of just a composite DC universe, so it's kind of hard for one character to really beat someone like him if they don't simply massively overpower him. Well, that's the end of the video. Like, subscribe, join my Discord, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.